I want you all to know that I'm flattered and very proud to have been asked to share my parents' story. And I want to thank the North Carolina Council on the Holocaust and each of you for this opportunity. As Karen said, I'm a second generation, a child of Holocaust survivors, and their story is central to my heritage and defines a huge part of who I am. My father passed away in 2003, and then my mother in 2005. Like so many survivors, they spoke little about what they went through until much later in their lives. How fortunate my family is to have had them become comfortable to share their story. We understood that their silence served two purposes. We understood that they wanted to protect themselves from the memories that had been pushed away into the recesses of their minds and their hearts so that they could put one foot in front of the other and rebuild their lives. And then to shield my brother and me from the horrors and suffering that they and their families endured. How else could they rebuild their shattered lives if not removed from that dark cloud that was interwoven into their soul? Their stories are but two of the millions to be told, and you've certainly heard several of those stories already. Let me at this point also mention that yesterday was National Holocaust Remembrance Day, and also the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And so I feel it's a particularly special time for me to share my story to add to those memories. Having said all that, their story is my story, and I always strive to keep it alive. I believe it is also our story, so that we too never forget the suffering inflicted and the courage it took to survive and to move forward. I pray we learn lessons from their experiences. My father was born in 1920 in Karelich, a tiny shtetl in Poland in what is now Belarus. Several years ago, I had the opportunity to visit Belarus and see the places that I will talk with you about. I saw much that seemed not to have changed in 75 years, and yet a great deal was very different. My father's family, observant Jews, were craftsmen. My grandfather was a glazier and a carpenter, and my grandmother kept their home and worked on the small farm. My father had a younger brother, an older sister, and an older brother, Chaim. My father went to Cheder, religious school, and he was well versed in Hebrew, Jewish history, traditions, and rituals. He also went to Polish public school as one of a small group of Jews. As a Jew, he was taunted and he was picked on by his classmates. Numerous complaints went to his teacher, ignored and dismissed. One day in 8th grade, boys ganged up on him and smeared pork on his lips. Observant Jews don't eat pork. Although he fought back, he had enough and told his father he was not returning to school. And so at age 11 or 12, he started working alongside his father. I sometimes wonder what my father could have accomplished if he had had more education, because he was smart, he was very sharp, and he was a very fast learner. In August 1939, after making a non-aggression pact with the Nazis, the Russians invaded eastern Poland. It seemed to my father's family that under Russian rule, the most significant change was the closing of synagogues and curtailing of religious observances. So these were practiced in secret, and much of the rest of their lives went on as usual. However, things changed drastically in June of 1941, when the Nazis invaded eastern Poland. Among other things, Jews were made to wear the yellow Star of David patch. Businesses were closed. Jews were not allowed to go to school. You know all about that. Many Jews, particularly the intelligentsia, were rounded up in the town square, forced to march to a dugout pit, told to strip, and then shot. And that was just the beginning. Karelich experienced his first action, where hundreds of Jews were executed in mass graves. and there were 4 others of these auctions. And townspeople were invited to watch, and they came to watch. My father's mother, younger brother, older sister, her husband, and their children were all murdered in this way. For me, the specifics of this horrific experience are vague because I could never bring myself to ask my father to go into details. The remaining Jews were rounded up and put into a small shtetl, the remaining Jews were rounded up in the shtetl and put into a small ghetto, which was small, confined, cramped, and later they were made to walk the 12 kilometers to the Novogrudok Ghetto, which held the Jews from all the surrounding areas. It was bigger, but it was still small and situated in a crowded cluster of buildings surrounded by a wood and barbed wire fence. An SS officer named Reuter was the commissar for the area. Words cannot begin to describe his inhumanity and his cruelty. Remember his name because it comes up again. The Nazis assigned everyone who could work to forced labor. My father and grandfather worked to clean up the rubble left from the Nazis' bombing. It was hard, backbreaking work. They were provided with a dark brown soup made of potato peels and water as their meal of the day. Each morning, people were lined up and divided into 2 groups. The strong, still able to work on one side, the weak, frail, sick on the other, destined to be killed. One morning, my grandfather was assigned to that side. Although my father tried to sneak him over, his father was too weak and downtrodden to make the move. My father told me that he said to his son, to my father, "You are young, you survive." My father saw him shot that morning. One day later on, my father was assigned to clean out abandoned Russian barracks, which the Russians wanted to use. Which the Germans wanted to use. The Russians left in haste when the Germans came in, and all kinds of material were left strewn about in piles. Once cleaned, the barracks were going to be used for lower-ranked German troops. Officers were already living and working out of confiscated Jewish homes. At that site, my father moved some blankets that were piled on the floor and covered what turned out to be a stash of rifles and ammunition. It was the end of the day, and the others had already carried out the trash and were assembling to march back to the ghetto. My father looked around to confirm that he was alone, and he grabbed a rifle. He stuffed the barrel of the rifle into the leg of his pants and secured the butt under his arm. Then he very tightly wrapped the oversized coat he was wearing and tied it extremely tight with the rope that he used to keep it in place. He knew that if he was discovered with a gun, he would be shot on the spot. Nevertheless, he marched back to the Novogrudok Ghetto with it. Now, what do you do with a rifle in the ghetto under the watchful eye of the German guards and the other inmates? As an experienced carpenter, he eventually found a loose board in the ghetto and hid the rifle until he could figure out what to do next. The following day, when he went back to the work site, he asked if he could go to the same barrack to finish the work, he said, and was told, "Schnell, schnell, schnell, quick, 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 quick." He took just enough time to grab some bullets, hide them in his clothes, and reported to the next work site. An opportunity was soon to come available, which would be the miracle of his escape from the ghetto, certainly saving his life. In the meantime, while he waited in the ghetto, my father was reunited with his older brother, Chaim. My father learned that unfortunately, Chaim's wife and younger children had been murdered. In the ghetto, Stories, rumors, gossip traveled quickly and served to feed the fears and the hopes of inmates. There was no real news, and people clung to what they could get. The rumors my father latched onto were of partisans in the thick, expansive Polish forests, Jewish partisans who chose to risk their lives hiding and fighting rather than being worked or starved to death, or merely being executed at the whim of a German or unsympathetic Pole. The Bielski brothers, who had lived in a nearby shtetl, formed a group that in time would expand into a partisan community in the Novogrudok forest. The brothers saw their parents murdered, shot in their homes by the Polish police who collaborated with the Nazis. The brothers vowed to survive for as long as necessary in the dense forests that they knew so well from their childhood. If you've seen the movie Defiance with Daniel Craig and Liev Schreiber, or read any of the books about the Bielski brothers, you're familiar with the story. The brothers' goal evolved from self-preservation into the mission espoused by its leader, Tuvia Bielski, the oldest brother, that it was more important to save Jews than to kill Germans. Tuvia and his two younger brothers, Zeus and Asiel, were the heroic rescuers of the largest number of Jews saving Jews during World War II. When my father heard this, he wanted to be one of those partisans because he had a goal. He wanted to survive and defend the memory of those he had lost. My father, as we knew him, was a quiet, unassuming, certainly unassertive man who followed the rules and didn't make waves. Nevertheless, back then, in his very early 20s, he was already a man of conviction with a strong sense of what was right. A rumor spread that an older woman who lived in the ghetto was going to be rescued and helped to escape by the help of her son, who was a member of the Bielski Partisans. My father told me how he followed her around to glean information. He was relentless in trying to learn where, when, and how her escape would occur. She finally yielded and told him. My father made plans to be ready and to bring his brother along. On the fateful night, he once again managed to hide the rifle in his clothes as he had before. He met with his brother, and together they dodged the searchlights. Very stealthily, they made their way to the fence, all the while aware of the German guards patrolling the perimeter and those in the tower ready to shoot anyone who attempted escape. The older woman was already there, having slipped through a small trench under the fence. My father slipped through the hole as well. And just as his brother was about to follow, they heard footsteps. My uncle, frightened for their lives, went back to his place in the ghetto for fear of being shot. My father says he vowed to get him out. Looking around at what my father described as a moonless night, he realized that he was one of several people who snuck under that fence, somewhat to the dismay of the man who came to rescue his mother. He must have been afraid to travel with more people than he planned. He told my father to go back, to which my father said he replied, "I would rather die trying to save myself than let them kill me in the ghetto. I'm going with you." And he did. The small group walked all night and tried to sleep during the day. They ate what they could forage. In several days, they arrived at the encampment and were met by Tuvia Bielski, who was notified of their approach by lookouts. When my father was asked why he risked coming all this way, he opened his coat like this, displayed the rifle, and told them he wanted to be a partisan. Tuvia welcomed him warmly and would have done so without the rifle. It turned out that my father was the only one who arrived from the ghetto with a rifle. Whether that rifle ever worked or not, we never knew. In the brigade, every partisan worked to support the group. My father had two jobs. One of his responsibilities was the food detail. Food was precious and hard to get. Some Polish farmers in the area supported Jewish partisan efforts because of their distaste for the Nazis. They provided crops or livestock, and equally as important, information that they heard in the village. Other farmers were Nazi sympathizers, and from them, my father told me, food had to be stolen. My father's other responsibility was to undermine the Nazis. Over time, the Bielski Partisans formed an alliance with the clandestine Russian army unit. The Russians supplied weapons, explosives, and intelligence to all partisan groups. The partisans, in turn, worked closely with the Russians to sabotage the Germans behind enemy lines. My quiet, unassertive father served on the detail that laid explosives under railroad tracks when scheduled German transports carrying troops and supplies were coming to the front. He said he didn't like doing it. He shuddered when he told me, and he did it nonetheless. In his mind, he told me he had a third task: to keep the commitment to his brother. Chaim did get out of the ghetto through a miraculous escape from a tunnel, dug with spoons and bare hands by the remaining ghetto inmates. That tunnel was more than 100 meters long, a little longer than a football field. The tunnel ceiling was supported by slats from their bunks. When I was in Belarus, I saw the tunnel entrance and exit, which now is part of a memorial museum. That escape is an amazing whole other story unto itself, perhaps for another time. Chaim made his way to the forest and he joined the Bielski troop. I can only imagine that reunion, having lost parents, siblings, spouse, and children. The brothers were together again, fighting to survive and avenging the loss of the ones that they loved. They were the only ones from their family to survive. My father was proud to be a Bielski partisan because he knew that he could stand up and fight when so many others were killed without even having a chance. My mother was born in 1921 in Novogrudok, Poland, again, now Belarus, also to observant Jewish parents. Growing up, she led a charmed life. She lived in a large brick house with her father and mother, her younger brother Shimon, uncle, aunt, and the aunt's husband. That uncle and my mother's aunt ran 3 butcher shops. Her mother was a homemaker with what I'm told is excellent skills as a seamstress, who taught young peasant women how to sew so they could have an income to assist their families. My mother and brother and her brother went to Cheder, religious school, and then to private school, and later they were allowed to take entrance exams for Polish gymnasium, which is like our high school, because they were students who earned all 5, what would be the equivalent of our A's. There was a quota for Jewish students, and of the 24 who applied, along with my mother, only 4 were admitted. When her family got word of the Nazi invasion into Poland in June 1941, they didn't believe that their lives would change all that much. During World War I, her father sold salami to the Germans and developed a business relationship with the invading army. When the possibility of the 2 children being sent to America came up in conversation, my mother said she didn't want to leave her family, and the idea was put to rest. However, the Jewish refugees fleeing from the West into Eastern Europe told stories of unimaginable atrocities. How could those stories be true? Well, the stories were true and then some. The Nazis bombed Novogrudok and then rolled in with tanks. The family tried to flee to a home they had in the outskirts of the city. Germans, anticipating the efforts of the Jewish families to leave, dropped leaflets from airplanes telling them that if they left, they would not be able to return to their homes. So they went back. Unfortunately, shortly after, Jews were rounded up for another auction. Those who were not shot at pre-dug graves were forced into the ghetto, bringing with them the little they could carry. In the confusion, my mother's father was badly injured from bricks, when bricks from an unstable building fell on him, and the family had to dig him out. Together, they managed to help him into the ghetto, where they took him into a makeshift infirmary. As my mother told me these stories, I was struck by the randomness of what happened to people. For example, one day, several young, very drunk Nazi soldiers yelled into the ghetto that they wanted a party with entertainment. They demanded that two young, handsome boys come out. The Judenrat, the Ghetto Jewish Council, selected my Uncle Shimon and another boy. The entertainment was that the boys were to dance on twigs and leaves the soldiers had set on fire. Having no choice, the boys followed orders. The young German soldiers quickly bored of this entertainment and they left. Shimon ran back to the ghetto. The other boy was burned so badly that he had to be carried. Shimon was taken to the infirmary and placed in a bed near my grandfather. In time, Shimon recovered. Unfortunately, my grandfather died of his injuries. Later, Shimon was taken from the ghetto by the young Polish police collaborators who knew the family had money, and they offered to return him to my mother and grandmother for a ransom. My mother said she raced around frantically trying to find some valuables and took whatever she could to the jail, and the police released him for the moment. In the ghetto, my mother and grandmother were assigned to clean the rubble caused by the bombing. Work sites sometimes were supervised by hired Poles. By a stroke of luck, purely random, my mother's supervisor was a young man she knew from gymnasium. He took her aside one day and told her that he had heard of another action. She should save herself if she could. My mother went over to my grandmother and told her that she planned to escape from the work detail rather than go back to the ghetto. She would come back for my grandmother that night and ask that my grandmother meet her at the ghetto fence. My grandmother was supposed to get word to Shimon. When my mother showed up that night, my grandmother was too afraid to crawl onto the fence, too despondent over the death of her husband, and uncertain about their fate outside the ghetto. She could not get herself to go. Shimon wasn't there either. My mother later found out he was hiding in an attic and too afraid to come out because he knew he would be shot if he was seen. Days later, he was found by those same Polish police who planned to hide him in another barrack near the ghetto. They thought they could hold Shimon there while they looked for my mother to give her an opportunity for another ransom. Of course, my mother had already escaped. On the way to that other barrack, to the other ghetto, the other barrack, where the inmates were not destined for murder at that time, but that would come later. They happened to run into the vile commissar, Reuter, who told the police to take Shimon directly to the location where Jews were being shot. He was too young to have any skills that would be of merit to them. My mother never saw her brother again. Not being able to save her brother was a guilt she carried literally until the day she died. I was with her the night before she passed away, and that was all she talked about. My mother later learned about what happened to Shimon, and also that my grandmother was executed as part of a large roundup where Jews were told to get down on their knees in circles, facing inward, and shot in the back of the head one by one. Out of the ghetto, my mother needed to find a place to hide, and she wandered that night trying to find the homes of Gentiles who knew her family. By morning, she found the home of Zoshka, a peasant woman whose son worked for the family. Zoshka hid my mother in the barn. Somehow, my mother's uncle and 2 others showed up shortly thereafter. Since 4 people could not hide in the barn, they dug a deep hole in the floor of the barn, which they covered with some boards and hay. They stayed in that dark, damp hole for nearly 2 years. They could go out only at night by climbing up a ladder and only to use the pigsty as a toilet, to leave no evidence of people living on the farm other than the farmer's family. The 4 of them in that hole sustained on nothing more than raw potato peels. Occasionally, Zoshka brought bread for them to share, and she also brought news. The news was about what was happening in the area, and she told them about some Jewish partisans who occasionally came to her for food, which she provided. My mother's uncle wanted those partisans to take them to the woods, and unfortunately, he got sick and died before they could come back. He was buried in the floor of the barn in a shallow grave, covered with dirt and with straw. All this activity frightened Zoshka because neighbors were known to spy on neighbors, and she was concerned for her family's safety. When the partisans did come back, they indeed did take my mother with them to the camp, a walk that took several nights. When she arrived at the Bielski Brigade, she was amazed to see people that she knew. And she told me they were walking around like free people. Some women gave her the first bath she had in almost 3 years, and they cut her hair to remove the lice. She had some food to eat and a bunk on which to sleep. She told me, "I feel like a free person again. I feel like a human being." Unfortunately, she was the only one of her family to survive. Not too long after my mother arrived at the Bielski camp, the war turned against the Germans, who were pushed west by the Russians. The 1,236 Jewish Bielski partisans, men, women, children, old, young, then walked out of the woods to make their trek back to Novogrudok. This part of their ordeal was over. Local farmers lined the path and watched in amazement that so many Jews had survived, practically under their noses. Surprisingly, my parents didn't meet in the forest, but rather after the end of the war in a city near Novogrudok, and eventually they made their way to a displaced persons camp in Cremona, Italy, where I was born after they were married. That part of their lives is another story for another time. And as Karen mentioned, that other time will be in February. For now, I want to close by telling you how proud I am of my parents for their will to survive, and how I marvel that through all they experienced, they never lost their faith in God and love of Judaism. That is almost incomprehensible to me. There are many, many stories like my family's. They tell of unimaginable horror and also great humanity. These stories are essential to share, and they can serve as lessons of hate and bullying, compassion and kindness, coping in times of crisis, and the resilience of the human spirit. I urge you to share and to learn these stories. Every story is precious, and I believe that keeping them alive keeps memories fresh and teaches us invaluable lessons. Thank you for this opportunity. It means a lot to me.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you. There's so much there to think about. Did you want to start, Lauren, with questions and see if we have folks who have questions?
If anybody has questions, feel free to either unmute yourself or you can type it in the chat and I will read it out.
I had one question, Susan. The movie Defiance, of course, Hollywood does its own thing a lot of times, but Tuvia indicated in the movie that the women couldn't give birth while they were in the forest. Was that true? Was that ever something that came up with conversation with your parents?
Well, what came up in conversation with my mother was that in the forest, when a woman became pregnant, she would try to go through an abortion. And the way they tried to abort a baby was to take onion peels and to cook them. And it forms a very vile, deep, deep purple liquid that they drank. One time in college, a friend and I tried that just out of curiosity, not out of need. And my assessment of that little remedy is it probably killed the mother first.
Mm-hmm.
I will also tell you that the movie Defiance is romanticized, as Hollywood will provide, and they need an audience. One of the things that I believe comes through in the movie that was true in conversation with my parents and what I saw, because the group of people who moved to New York City when they immigrated to the United States formed clusters to memorialize the various towns from which they came. And Tuvia Bielski was considered a saint. He was revered.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't seek any kind of credit or recognition for himself. He went out of his way to acknowledge people and to recognize them and to be available for them. He was a very quiet, humble man. And truly, he was revered by the people whose lives he saved, and rightfully so.
Susan, we have a question. Would you be available to speak to students via Zoom?
I would be available, sure.
And then would you like me to pull up any of the pictures, or do you want to say?
Yes, I would love for you to do that. What I've been able to do, because my parents saved whatever papers they had, which I found after they passed away, was several years ago, I had the opportunity to go to the Florida Holocaust Museum in St. Petersburg, Florida, and came to this oversized poster, and I was stopped in my tracks because that's a poster of my father. That poster is in the resistance section of the museum. And I was dumbfounded and speechless. That's my father. So through a fair amount of effort, you can go to the next picture, please. What we were able to find was a better picture. Definitely that's my father. And you'll notice he has a rifle. This one I'm sure works. He has a shoulder holster with a pistol. And when I saw this, my first thought was, thank God my father has a warm coat, because I know how cold it was there. Then, after some more research, what we found out was that this was part of a larger picture, and if you could show that slide, please, of 3 partisans. I wish that I knew who they were, because I would love to be able to reach out to their families, but we haven't been able to find anything about them. Next picture, please. This is a picture of my mother that was taken in Italy in the displaced persons camp. And she looks much better than she would have looked after the war, for sure. And then the last picture actually is a video. Am I correct?
Mm-hmm. It is.
Lauren? Okay. Let me introduce this video.
Okay.
When the movie Defiance came out, my daughter-in-law mentioned to her rabbi, my son and daughter-in-law live in Houston, that my son's grandfather was with the Bielski Partisans. And the rabbi called him in and they had a conversation about it, and then weeks went by and it wasn't brought up again until in the local Jewish weekly publication, it was broadcast that the movie Defiance was really well received, and that there was going to be an article, a feature article coming up in a subsequent issue. And they contacted my son, and they had a 2-page spread of my son talking about my father. I can't tell you how touching that is. Fast forward 10 years, 12 years, my son gets a phone call from the Houston Holocaust Museum, huge, beautiful museum. And he was asked to come and speak with the director, and he went and was told that they would like for him to be the man who introduces the Lyndon Baines Johnson Moral Courage Award. And the award that year was being given to the Bielski Partisans, or their survivors, and an organization called the Violins of Hope. The Violins of Hope was started by a man who happened to be married to one of the Bielski daughters. And he is a violinist and a violin restorer, and he was able to salvage violins that were found after the end of the war. And so my son had the opportunity to present this award and to meet a number of the Bielski family members or the survivors. And the little video clip that you're going to see is very professionally done, and it will give you kind of an idea of another perspective of the movie. So Karen, if you would, you can roll it.
My grandfather left the ghetto when he was around 16 years old. They had a rough life in the ghetto. They had a rough life before the ghetto. When he was in grade school, classmates of his took pork and rubbed it on his face. My grandfather was a very small, meek man, but the things that he did during the war were most definitely not meek. He found a rifle. He took the rifle, stuck it in his boots and in his pants, and tied a rope around his, like a belt, and a very, very big overcoat. And when he got to where the Bielskis were, he said, "Who are you? Why are you here? Go back. You have to go back." He said, "No, I'm not going back. I'm coming with you." And he lifted up his coat and said, "I have something I can contribute."
We have all chosen this. To live here free like human beings for as long as we can. Every day of freedom is like an act of faith.
The Bielskis were an armed resistance. They did what they needed to do to survive. Not everybody was a fighter. Some were important in providing clothes and providing food. They had the resistance movement. They were also this larger community to help save the Jews during this time frame. One of my grandfather's jobs was to bomb the railroad tracks and the supply trains, either going to the front or returning from the front. So they would be out there and they'd plant the TNT and they'd explode the tracks. The people who lost their families, this was their new family that they had. You had carpenters like my grandfather's, you had doctors, you had tailors, and if you didn't have a skill set they needed, they would train you to do what you needed to do.
When you are rested and settled, you will be assigned work duties. Everyone will work. There are no exceptions.
About 10,000 people saved by the Bielskis of their children and the grandchildren, and I know that there are many more.
I think it's so wonderful that people did that, how successful they were apparently in what they did. And I'm terribly happy that we had heroes. And that needs to be more known about people like the Bielski brothers.
My grandfather's proudest moments were saying the Shehechianu at my bar mitzvah, my sister's bar mitzvah, seeing that his grandkids were retaining their Jewish lives cemented that what he did was right. And if it wasn't for the Bielskis and what they did, I wouldn't be here today.
I saw one of the questions come up on the chat, and I believe that question was, did my parents stay in touch with the Bielskis? Originally, Tevye Bielski and his family, his wife, someone that he met in the forest and married, moved to Israel and then eventually came to New York. And yes, because most of the survivors lost practically all their family, if not all their family, the people with whom they survived became their family, just as my son said. And they would get together to celebrate Jewish holidays, to celebrate milestone occasions. And at Tevye Bielski's 80th birthday, there was a huge, huge banquet at the Waldorf Astoria in his honor. And there were hundreds and hundreds of people there. And what I was told was that people lined up at the end to walk up to him, now an old man, to walk up to him and thank him for saving their lives, because they wouldn't be there and their children wouldn't be where they are were it not for him.
We have another question. It says, did your parents have contacts prior to coming to the United States themselves?
What do you mean contact?
Says, did your parents have contacts themselves prior coming to the United States? So I'm assuming.
My parents met after the war in Poland.
Mhm.
And together made their way to Italy. And I'll be talking about that in detail in February.
And I thought I saw another one pop up. How did the Holocaust experience of your parents impact your childhood through high school?
It's quite a dynamic question. I knew that my parents were different. I knew that their backgrounds were different. And it wasn't just that they spoke with an accent. I knew they were different because today they both would have been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress. My mother was afraid of dark, which you could which can understand given that she lived in a dark hole for 2 years, and loud noises. And my father, I think that part of my father's meekness was one of his symptoms. And to say that they were overprotective would be a gross understatement. I also knew that we had extended family that were not really our family. And then as I grew older, I learned more and more. And despite all that, I didn't ask a lot of questions because I was afraid. And the time when my parents started to speak was when my son was in middle school. He had a project to interview someone, couldn't be a parent, who could talk about family heritage because they were creating family trees. And I suggested he talk to his grandfather. My mother really did not like to talk about any of it. My father was more prone to it. She eventually came around. And when he went to my father and explained what he had to do, my father started opening up, and it was wonderful. And I had the wherewithal to make homemade cassette tapes of those conversations, which I am now in the process of transcribing. The cassette tapes are of poor quality, but I'm very fortunate to have them because so few of the people I know have anything like that. And so that's where a lot of these stories came from, the stories that I share today.
Any other questions from anybody?
I think there was one up there about the link, the video, and someone asked if they could get a link to it.
If you're talking about the link to the video that my son was in, that was produced by the Holocaust Museum, it's not a link that I can make available to you because it's proprietary to the museum. I can show it, but I can't distribute it. And while I have the floor, what I'd like to do is I would like to thank each of you for the work that you do. Because without the work that you do, nobody would know these stories, or very few people would know these stories. And as an educator myself, I know how significant it is to place concepts like bullying and hatred into real life experiences so that students can identify with them. And from the bottom of my heart, I thank you for your work. So much. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. Just to share, I am I was an educator and I continue to be an educator. I used to teach high school and now I teach college. And I commend you for what you do because I think it's so important and so significant. So I am going to share my screen. And here we are. Holocaust testimonies and stories often tell about people being sent to their death with no resistance. And I've heard people say like sheep to slaughter. And that perhaps has been the case in some situations, but not in all situations. And I believe many stories about the Holocaust end with the end of World War II. And I don't think that's the end of the story. And so thank you for the privilege and the honor to have told the first part of the story last month, and for me to have the opportunity to pick up where I left off and to tell the rest of the story. The rest of the story, I believe, is a big part of the immigration story that we all know about in America. Immigration is part of the American fabric. It's what makes our country diverse, and it's what makes our culture very rich. As Karen said, I'm a second-generation survivor, a child of Holocaust survivors. In our conversation today, I'll only provide a short overview of my parents' specific Holocaust experiences because they are on the other tape. However, there's more to the Holocaust story than what happened between 1941 and 1944. Understanding the past really helps us understand the present, understand and plan for the future. What does it mean to be a second generation? I'll come back to this question because I think it's a really important question. My parents were victims, they were heroes, they were fighters, and they were survivors. And they had to continue the will to survive, not only during the war, but also through and into their immigration, because the place they called home and the people about whom they cared about the most were all gone. They had to come to terms with significant physical, emotional, and psychological trauma. And in order to build a new life, they had to be able to take the perspective that it was worth building a new life. The great challenges that they faced, they carried with them for the rest of their lives. My parents' Holocaust background has definitely shaped who I am and what I am. And I believe it's critical to know those backgrounds for all of us, whatever our family background is, because those backgrounds shape who we are as well, for all of us. My parents were born in Poland, in what is now Belarus. When I think back to the journey of their immigration, I really believe that their immigration started in 1939. It started in 1939 when the Soviets and the Nazis divided up Poland. The Soviets took over the part of Poland where my parents lived, where they were born, and slowly they began to lose their religious freedoms, and then over time they lost other freedoms. However, for the most part, although parts of their life were underground, for the most part their life went on. And then everything changed in 1941 when the Nazis came in, despite the non-aggression pact, and bombed Poland, and the city that I'm going to talk about is Novogrudok, and bombed Novogrudok. What they did was they rounded up the Jews from the surrounding ghettos and also from the city of Novogrudok, and those that they didn't murder or exterminate in pre-dug graves were herded into the Novogrudok Ghetto, which was small and cramped and which became people's new life for a number of years to come. Everyone who could work was forced to work, and if you could no longer work, you were killed. In 2016, I was very fortunate to be able to visit Belarus. And the places that I'll talk about are places that I went to see, ground that I walked on, and I cannot begin to tell you the impact of that experience. Poland was devastated during World War II. It lost 50% of its economic resources, and it lost 30% of its population. The loss of any life is tragic. And during World War II, 3 million Poles lost their lives and 3 million Jews lost their lives. However, those numbers do not balance out and they do not equate, because the Poles lost less than 10% of their population and Jews lost 94% of their population in Poland. Most of the Poles lost their lives because they were casualties of war. Very unfortunate. Most of the Jews lost their lives purposefully because they were intended targets. They were executed, they were murdered, they were starved to death, or they were sent to concentration camps, and you know what happened there. The Poles took the homes, the land, the businesses, the property of Jews, and then refused to give them back after the war. It was a time that, although I grew up with these stories, to this day, it's so hard to still believe it. It's so hard to accept what people can do to one another. My father was born in a tiny shtetl called Karelich in 1920. He was born to an observant Jewish family. His father was a craftsman, a carpenter and a glazier. His mother kept the house and also managed a small family farm. When my father was in Polish elementary school, he was harassed because he was Jewish, and his complaints to teachers went unnoticed and then went ignored. And at one point, a group of boys tackled him to the ground and rubbed pork on his lips, and that's when he decided he was never going back to school again. And so he was forced to work with his father. When the Germans invaded, they took my father and grandfather into the ghetto, where they were relegated to forced labor. My grandfather was executed because he got too old and too tired to work. My father was very fortunate to be able to escape from a work detail and join the Bielski Partisans in the thick woods of the Novogrudok forest in Poland. And I talked about this before, so I'm not going to go into detail. However, I do want to mention that the Bielski Partisan Brigade was led by Tuvia Bielski, who believed that it was more important to save Jews than it was to kill Nazis. And so Jews, regardless of age, regardless of health, regardless of gender, were welcomed into the troop because it was their way to survive. And if you've seen the movie Defiance, you know the general story. It's a story of heroism, and it's a story of resistance, and it's also a story of extreme struggle. As it turns out, later on we learned that the Bielski Partisans was the largest group of Jews saving Jews during World War II. During the Holocaust, my father lost his mother, whose picture is up here on the screen, his younger brother, his older sister, her husband, and her children. My mother grew up in Novogrudok. She was born in 1921. And although my parents were not in the ghetto at the same time, she too escaped from the Novogrudok Ghetto and was able to hide in the floor of a barn in a hole that was dug by Righteous Gentiles. She lived in that hole for 2 years. When she finally got out of the hole and made her way also to the woods to the Bielski Partisans, she had had her first bath in almost 3 years. During the course of the Holocaust, my mother lost her father and mother and her brother, pictured here, her aunt, her uncle, and her aunt's husband. My mother was the only one in her family to have survived. If I knew the name of the Righteous Gentile that helped to hide and save my mother, I would share that with Yad Vashem. Unfortunately, I don't have that information. What I do have is pretty amazing, because in 2006, by sheer happenstance, my brother visited the Florida Holocaust Museum in St. Petersburg, Florida. And as he walked into the resistance section, he noticed this poster. That poster is my father. What for some reason is not showing, all right. That poster, it turns out, we found later, came from this picture of 3 partisans. The first thing that came to mind when I saw that poster of my father was, oh, thank God he had warm clothes in the winter. The clothes that you see and the rifles and the pistols were provided by the clandestine Soviet Army unit that was hiding in the Novogrudok forest behind enemy lines trying to defeat the Nazis. And partisan groups were working closely with that Russian unit to sabotage and to undermine the Nazi efforts. At the end of the war, 11 million people were displaced. They represented an array of religions, of cultures, an array of ethnicities, and most of them were able to be repatriated to their homes and to their countries. The non-Jews of those 11 million, 850,000, also wanted to go back to their homes, but they could not. They couldn't go back because their homes had been taken and they weren't going to be returned, or the areas where they lived were obliterated by bombs. And so they basically had nowhere to go. They had survived the ghettos, they had survived hiding, they had survived being in with partisans, and many of them were concentration camp survivors as well. They had their lives and they had nothing else. No place to go and no one to care for them. There's a story that I found in my research of the kind of atrocities that were performed after the war, when Jews tried to return to their homes. And in one village in particular, there was a pogrom in 1946, this is after the war, in which all the Jews who survived and went back to the village were murdered. Even though my parents were both in the Bielski Partisan Brigade, they didn't meet until after the war, and they made their trek back to Novogrudok. There were 1,236 Jews that walked out of that forest the day that the Soviets let them know that they had won. It's an amazing number. It's a drop in the bucket, and yet it's an amazing number. Those 850,000 people presented tremendous challenges to the Allied military, because while they performed heroic feats in fighting the war, they did not know how to house and care for 850,000 people. In February 1945, the 3 leaders of the Allied forces met at the Yalta Conference And among other things, they discussed how are they going to take care of 850,000 people who could not be repatriated because of anti-Semitism. That's when the label displaced persons came into being. And the Allied military was put in charge of these $850,000, my mistake, 850,000 people. They created makeshift housing. Any place they could find, it could be old school buildings, it could be bombed out buildings, wherever they could find to put up barracks is what they did. However, there was no system and there were no standards. And so food was scarce. Clothing, remember, these people had nothing. They had the clothes on their back. Food was scarce and medical care was also very scarce. And there are heroic stories of Allied military soldiers sharing what they had with some of these displaced persons. The conditions were horrific, and so it wasn't uncommon for displaced persons to try to move from camp to camp to find better living conditions, and they were always in search of some help. It was an endless process. Nearly all of the displaced persons were malnourished. A great number of them were ill, and some were dying. And in addition to all of that, they suffered from the trauma that they had experienced and the scars that would live with them forever. The United States sent inspectors to check out these accommodations, and they were appalled by the conditions, not the fault of the military necessarily, but the fault of no preparation and no planning and no resources. And so the United States commissioned something that turned out to be called the Harrison Report. The Harrison Report visited the various makeshift campsites, and in the report discussed the poor nutrition and the lack of food, the lack of medical care, the lack of any kind of support services to address the trauma that had been felt, and there was nothing in the way of social services or any kind of humane support. Well, following the Harrison Report, President Truman appointed a special military advisory group to help ensure the improvement of these living conditions. So although the Holocaust was over and people were technically safe, their lives were still miserable. Eventually, the oversight of these conditions was turned over to the United Nations through UNRWA, UNRRA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. And then over time, other agencies joined in the effort to create some kind of a way for people to regain their lives and have their needs addressed. My parents eventually were sent to Camp Bagnoli in Cremona, Italy, the camp is located in an abandoned monastery, and it's just south of Milan. They took trains and they walked across the Alps to get to Italy. I had mentioned earlier that the displaced persons were not only physically and mentally harmed, but they also had a great suspicion and skepticism of any kind of authority. And the idea of taking a train was horrific. And so the authorities came up with a plan that they would provide scripts that displaced persons could turn in at the train station to receive tickets, because otherwise they refused to get on the trains. Between 1945 and 1947, between 1,000 and 1,200 Jewish displaced persons lived in this abandoned monastery. The monastery consisted of 3 churches. One was used for families to live, and one was for orphan children, and the third was the administration building, which had the cafeteria and other services. In time, UNRWA was joined by JOINT, which is the American Joint Distribution Committee, which provided social and community service support to the 1,000 people who lived in this facility and in the other camps. The orphanage was the first orphanage established for Holocaust Jewish orphans. In 2018, by a sheer miracle, I was able to find the man, an architect, who actually has the keys to this monastery. I have to thank the internet, because it was a fluke of good luck. And he spent days with us. He and a crew had cleaned out the monasteries, locked them up, and he knew the facility very well. He spent days with us walking through the monastery and showing us all of the things that he had found. And I'm going to share some of that with you. The DPs lived in one church which was called Corpus Domini. And while the conditions were crowded and there was absolutely no privacy, they were safe, they had a roof over their head, and it was peacetime. What the displaced persons did to create some semblance of privacy was they built room dividers with clay blocks that they made, and also hung curtains. Meals were offered through a central commissary kitchen. These are photographs that I took of some of the walls, and you can see the paint is peeling, but some of the writing is still there. And what it demonstrates is the desire to begin to rebuild a life. And what you see in the middle picture says HaSefer, which means the school. This was supposed to have been a temporary experience for the displaced persons. For my parents, temporary was 5 years. In a section of the monastery, Angelo has created a storage area where all of the artifacts that have left behind have been stored. And it's his intent in the next few years, COVID notwithstanding, to create a museum in that monastery. Because the displaced persons now had what appeared to be some semblance of stability in their lives, they worked together and created internal governance and created an array of programs. This is what you would consider a typical school picture. We found this picture through the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And this too is another miracle of good luck. This picture was taken in front of HaSefer, the school, and it's called the Chaim Bialik School. Chaim Bialik was a well-respected Polish Jewish poet. In addition to schools at the Bagnali camp, there were excellent vocational training programs, and they were commended because in one particular program, the young men who worked there, it was restricted to men, were able to make small radios, and those radios were distributed to other camps throughout Italy. Over time, there were theater groups, there were music groups, there was the celebration of holidays, there was a newspaper printed in Yiddish, there were holiday celebrations, including weddings, and my parents were married there, and babies were born, and I was one of those babies. They also had frequent demonstrations and parades in support of the creation of a state in Israel, of creating Palestine as a state in Israel. And they always had the hope of creating a home in a very distant land. So back to this picture. Camp Bagnali had a nursery school, an elementary, and a high school. And in this picture, in the third row, seated, second person from the left in a white dress is my mother. It's unmistakable. It's my mother. So let me tell you more about this picture. When we went back and were able to visit Camp Bagnali, we stood in front of that wall. And while it sounds hokey, that's me and my husband, shorter hair then because it was I had haircuts. It wasn't COVID. And it's me and my husband, and I'm holding that picture. As hokey as that sounds, I cannot tell you how much that means to me. I'm proud to be able to tell the story. It's not easy. In 1945, immigration opportunities for Jewish displaced persons were very limited. Some applied and tried to get into Palestine, some to Canada, and some to South America. Those who wanted to come to the United States, what they called America, had to jump through immeasurable hurdles. In order to get a visa, they had to prove that they had someone in America who, in the event it was necessary, would help them financially. They had to be relatively healthy. They had to ensure that they could work and that they would not take jobs away from American workers, and that they would have a place to live. You have to remember that they didn't speak English. And so communicating with relatives, first finding relatives overseas and then communicating with relatives overseas was quite a challenge. On December 22nd, 1945, President Truman issued an executive order called the Truman Directive. And with this executive order, he loosened a little bit the immigration quotas for DPs, displaced persons. So over a period of time, until 1952, 400,000 displaced persons were admitted to America. Of those 400,000, approximately 20%, or 80,000, were Jewish. My parents were among those 400,000 who were admitted to the United States. In 1949, Camp Agnoli was closed, and my parents were sent to another camp in Naples. And Naples turned out to be their port of exit from Italy and the next leg of their journey. On November 10th, 1949, we boarded the SSS Marine Jumper, which you see in this picture. It was a converted cargo ship, and we traveled in steerage. I have the manifest from that ship, and my father, my mother, and I are the first 3 names on that list. My father volunteered to work in the kitchen as a way to pay for the trip. My mother was seasick the whole trip. So sick that she couldn't even eat the ice cream that my father brought her. And I have to share with you that ice cream and whipped cream were the 2 predominant food groups that my mother had. My job on this ship was, as a toddler, to take care of my mother. At the beginning of my talk, I mentioned that I was a second generation, and I asked, what does that mean? One of the things it means is that my parents had lifelong health and emotional issues. These resulted from the malnutrition and from their horrific experiences. And what I'm told is that if all of this had happened today, they would have been diagnosed with PTSD. I'm not a physician. I will tell you that my mother had PTSD. And one of her issues was that her coping skills were compromised. There was nothing in the world that she loved more than her family, and sometimes it was hard for her to manage her family. And so one of my jobs was to mother my mother. We arrived in the port of New York on December 21st, 1949. Thanksgiving was always my father's favorite American holiday because he was so thankful to be in America and to be in a free country where they could provide for a better life for their children, for my brother and for me. What you see on the left here is a clipping from a newspaper that some relative had saved. Unfortunately, we don't have the date and we don't have the name of the paper, but that's my mother holding little baby cute me, my father standing behind her, and a family friend whom I knew standing behind my father. The picture on the right doesn't have a date on the back. It was taken, I'm guessing, just before we left Italy or right after we came to America. And that again is cute little me in between my mother and my father. In 2008, when the movie Defiance came out, Defiance, that stars Daniel Craig of 007 notoriety, the movie familiarized a much wider audience with a story of heroism and struggle that took place during the Holocaust. A newspaper reporter somehow found out that my son, the article that you see on the right, that his grandfather, my father, was with the Bielski Partisans. And he interviewed my son, and the article that you see, full-page article, was done of the stories that my son told about my father. Just another miracle. In 2016, my son got a phone call from the Holocaust Museum in Houston, where he lives, and he was asked to come in to speak to the director. The director took out that article and explained to him that if he was interested, they would like him to make the presentation of the Lyndon Baines Johnson Award for Moral Courage. That award is offered and is presented annually to an individual or a group who take a stand against injustice, hatred, and prejudice, and who, using their skills and influence, make the world a better place for all people. My son was the person who made that award. I cannot tell you how proud I am of our heritage and how we have been able to evolve and learn more as time goes on. So I'm going to ask Laura now to show a little video clip that some of you will have seen. It's just a few minutes long, that was made as part of the introduction to the award that my son presented. Lauren, I don't think that we have the audio.
It would help if I unmuted myself.
Okay, that works.
My grandfather left the ghetto when he was around 16 years old. They had a rough life in the ghetto. They had a rough life before the ghetto. When he was in grade school, classmates of his took pork and rubbed it on his face. My grandfather was a very small, meek man, but the things that he did during the war were most definitely not meek. He found a rifle. He took the rifle, stuck it in his boots and in his pants, and tied a rope around his, like a belt, and a very, very big overcoat. And when he got to where the Bielskis were, he said, "Who are you? Why are you here? Go back. You have to go back." He said, "No, I'm not going back. I'm coming with you." And he lifted up his coat and said, "I have something I can contribute."
We have all chosen this. To live here free like human beings for as long as we can. Every day of freedom is like an act of faith.
The Bielskis were an armed resistance. They did what they needed to do to survive. Not everybody was a fighter. Some were important in providing clothes and providing food. They had the resistance movement, but they were also this larger community to help save the Jews during this time frame. One of my grandfather's jobs was to bomb the railroad tracks and the supply trains, either going to the front or returning from the front. So they would be out there and they'd plant the TNT and they'd explode the tracks. The people who lost their families, this was their new family that they had. You had carpenters like my grandfather's, you had doctors, you had tailors, and if you didn't have a skill set they needed, they would train you to do what you needed to do.
When you are rested and settled, you will be assigned work duties. Everyone will work. There are no exceptions.
About 10,000 people saved by the Bielskis of their children and the grandchildren, and I know that there are many more.
I think it's so wonderful that people did that, how successful they were apparently in what they did. And I'm terribly happy that we had heroes. And that needs to be more known about people like Bielski brothers.
My grandfather's proudest moments were saying the Shehechianu at my bar mitzvah, my sister's bar mitzvah, seeing that his grandkids were retaining their Jewish lives cemented that what he did was right. If it wasn't for the Bielskis and what they did, I wouldn't be here today.
And I'm going to go back to sharing my screen.
Yes.
And I'm trying to advance my screen, but for some reason, there it goes. Okay, so my family's history has taken unbelievable twists and turns that my parents could not have begun to imagine when they were growing up in the 1920s in Poland. It's been said that we plan our lives looking forward and we understand our lives looking backward. I am so grateful to have as much information as I have about my family's experiences, about their thoughts and their feelings about what they went through. It all started with asking questions, and I will admit to you that until they were in their later years, my parents were very reluctant to speak about this. My son in middle school had a project in which he had to create a family tree. And I suggested he go and talk to his papa, to my father. And my father, who had dropped hints all along the way over the course of the years, sat down with my son and told him stories that we had never heard. And once the floodgates opened, the more we asked, the more he told. I know as much as I know, and yet I wish I knew a lot more. I will tell you that it all started with asking questions and with listening, no judgment, listening and asking more questions. And so the question that I would like to leave with each of you is this: what is your family story? It doesn't matter what the family, it doesn't matter what the background. Every family story is valuable. And if you can put together the threads of your family story, it only enriches your family. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Susan. Susan, do you mind going back to some of your beginning slides of your parents' family?
Sure.
Some of those didn't pop up originally, so I'm going to see if we can get them to pop up.
Oh, no, they didn't pop up on purpose.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
Let me
gotcha.
show it to you, because we don't have anything.
Gotcha.
I'll just slide through it very quickly. Here we go. The only thing we have of my father's family is this picture that we got from a cousin who lived in America. The only thing that we have of my mother's family are these pictures that also came from people who lived in America. There are no pictures. All there is memories.
Do we have questions? Would you, anyone have questions that they'd like to put in the chat, or raise your hand and unmute yourself and ask Susan?
Please feel free to ask questions, because they don't make me uncomfortable at all.
So Susan, ask about the immigration. You all came in through Ellis Island?
Actually, no. We came in through the Port of New York, and for years I had the myth that we came in through Ellis Island and the fantasy of the glory of that.
Right.
And then I found out, no, it was the Port of New York, because I found the manifest. And I'll tell you a funny story. It's funny now. When we came into the Port of New York, which is basically the Bowery, my mother refused to get off the ship. She said that she had been deceived, as we all had been, that we were not in America, because in America, the streets are paved with gold, and all she saw was trash.
Oh.
This could not be America, and to go back out to sea and to take them to America. Eventually, she got off the ship, and we settled into a tenement on the Lower East Side. Those are really my first memories. And then eventually from there, we moved up to Washington Heights, still in New York City. And for years and years and years, we had boarders so that my parents could afford their rent.
Wow. Thank you. Anyone else? Don't be afraid.
I read that
Comment.
yes, thank you. And I will tell you that part of the reason that I think that the Holocaust story does not end with the end of World War II is because people took their experiences with them. And the end of the war did not mean that their lives were stable. And with all of the immigration issues that we have now going on in this country, I think these are important stories to tell.
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate the opportunity to be able to share it. Did my parents ever publicly share their stories, or were they only comfortable sharing with family? That's a wonderful question. Once my parents opened up, and my father was much more prone to share the story, my mother would often leave the room because the memories of the story were too much for her to handle. Over time, however, she also began to share. And what I had the wherewithal to do was to take out an old cassette recorder and record their stories. My father's stories are very linear. This happened, and then this happened, and this. My mother's stories go all over the place.
Right.
However, having those recordings is amazing. And I have listened to them, and I'm now transcribing them. I don't know what I'll do with the transcriptions, whether I'll expand them or not, but I will tell you that having them is so gratifying. And so I encourage all of you, if you are able to record, whether it's video or audio, to record your family members, because at some point in the future, someone is going to have questions to ask, and you can go back to them and you'll have some answers.
Mm-hmm.
My parents were never comfortable enough to go to the Shoah Foundation and make a recording there. That was a great question.
It was. We had another one. What do you teach at college?
I teach leadership and leadership development, and I teach MBA students primarily, although my current teaching is with adult, first generation college students who are on full scholarship, and they work during the day and they go to school at night. And they are an amazing group of young people. We recently moved to North Carolina from Florida, and before COVID, I was going back 1 week a month. And I can't begin to tell you how proud I am of those students. We had 95% retention. That means 95% of them graduated, and every one of them graduated with what we would consider a legitimate job opportunity. And so they worked very hard, and they deserved everything they got because they worked for it. Did my parents have any quirks? I'm sorry, that went off too quickly and I couldn't catch it.
Do parents have any quirks or habits that the result of their experiences? I've heard of other survivors keeping full cabinets at all times. Any such quirks?
Yes, we never wasted any food because you just didn't waste food. And there was always food in the refrigerator and in the pantry. And I have memories of my parents going to weddings or bar mitzvahs and other celebrations and putting bread into my mother putting bread into her purse. And other quirks, the picture that you saw of my father's mother, we could not hang that up in our apartment because it scared my mother too much. And so there were things like that, and loud noises were hard.
There was another question. Did your parents or family ever attend the Bielski Brigade events or reunions? And do your children share the stories of your family?
My parents, we knew Tevye Bielski. He was considered to be a saint amongst the survivors. And there were societies that met on a regular basis because, as my son said, they'd lost all of their family. So the survivors became their family. And on his 80th birthday in the Waldorf Astoria, he was quite old and not healthy at the time. There was a birthday celebration and a tribute for Tevye Bielski. And my parents went to that. And I remember my mother getting all dressed up, and it was quite an event. And my parents told me that they would be home by 11, and they were home at 2. These are the days way before cell phones. And I learned a good deal of my worrying from my mother. And I couldn't imagine where they were. And what they told me was that after the dinner, people lined up. My apologies. People lined up to take his hand and to thank him.
Oh.
So yes, there was a lot of contact and some socializing, and certainly memorials. And this was their new family, and they were fortunate to have these people who understood what their issues were.
We have a comment from Bernice. Taking food home like that was also common among people here who went through the Great Depression. And of course, the Depression hit Europe. I mean, it was a global depression. So.
No, it's not surprising. And as I said, we never wasted any food.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Oh, and there was another part to that. My children know the story.
Okay.
My grandchildren are still too young. They range in age from 5 until 9. Although yesterday when I did a Zoom call with my 9-year-old granddaughter, she was reading the graphic novel of the Anne Frank story.
Oh, good.
And my son and daughter-in-law took their kids, now 5 and 9, on a trip, and they went to Amsterdam, and they went to visit the Anne Frank house. And the little one was at the time too young to understand it. But the 9-year-old, I guess she was around 6 or 7 at the time, was mesmerized. And they tried to tell her the story as best they could that was age appropriate. My son is a biomedical engineer, and the reason he is in Houston is because he works for a contractor of NASA, and he supports the International Space Station.